Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. Today we are joined by Ms. Krish Vignarajah, a Democratic candidate for governor here in the state of Maryland. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for tuning in.
My name is Shannon Coleman Siciliano. I serve as co-executive director at Strong Schools Maryland. Strong Schools Maryland, we're a 501c3 organization, and our mission is to ensure that Maryland public school students have a world-class education. And so today we are not here to, we are not in support of any particular candidate or party, but we do believe that the candidate strongest in education and strongest on the Kirwan Commission recommendations will win the election. And so no pressure there, but education we think is the number one issue in this election cycle. And so we're gonna go over, we have a few questions related to policy, funding, and we want to hear a little bit about your vision for Maryland students. Yeah. And so I'm going to jump right in with some policy questions.
Great.
So when we think about the Kirwan Commission, they say that what we spend our money on, the policy, is just as important as how much money we spend.
Exactly.
And so I want to start by thinking a little bit more broad and just the Maryland State Constitution itself. Our Maryland State Constitution says that every student in Maryland deserves a thorough and efficient system of public education, which means that we are enabling our students to meet state standards. And so my question to you is, what does that mean to you?
Yeah, so I come at that question in two respects. One is the personal side of it, in the sense that I am the only candidate in the field who is the product of Maryland Public Schools from kindergarten through 12th grade. I also am the only candidate who's the daughter of two Baltimore City public school teachers. My father retired last year as the oldest public school teacher in the state at the age of 80. They committed their life service to education because it is the most important thing to make sure we give our kids the ability to realize their potential. I'm running with a lifelong teacher, Sharon Blake, who is also the president of the Baltimore Teachers Union, because education is my top issue. And it is because in order for us to get every other piece of this right, whether it is the economy, whether it is supporting and strengthening our communities, we have to make sure that our backbone, our children, are educated and ready for the world, ready to undertake careers. But I also come at this as Michelle Obama's policy director at the White House, where two of our four initiatives were focused on education. Reach Higher, which was about getting more of our high school kids into 2- and 4-year colleges, but also Let Girls Learn, which was about getting girls to complete their middle school and high school educations. And so when I think of what that means, it means making sure that every child, regardless of their zip code, regardless of what school district you grow up in, has the basic opportunity to get a quality, world-class education to realize your potential.
And do you think that we are meeting that goal now?
No. And this is why we need a new governor. And this is why we need a governor who understands both personally and professionally what education can mean. I wouldn't have served as Michelle Obama's policy director except that I had the chance to go from Woodlawn to the White House. And I know that that's important for every child. But right now, under Governor Hogan, our schools have gone from 1st to 6th. We are middle of the pack when it comes to a lot of assessments, including in math and the sciences, but also in the humanities. We are falling short of where we need to be.
Okay. So let's look or talk a little bit more about the Kirwan recommendations. And so the Kirwan Commission, they put out policy recommendations around 5 policy areas. And the policy areas: early childhood education, high quality teachers and leaders, more resources for at-risk youth, college and career readiness pathways, and governance and accountability. And so when you think of those, those 5 policy areas, at Strong Schools Maryland, we think that the next governor needs to embody all of them. Yeah. That you can't just take 1 or 2 of the policy areas and decide to do 1 or 2 projects. Yeah. That it's they need to be implemented together. So as future governor, what do you think about that?
Yeah. I mean, I completely agree. It is why we have set forth a comprehensive education policy from cradle to career, meaning investing in universal pre-K, fixing the funding inequities, rebuilding our crumbling schools, making sure we invest in science, technology, engineering, arts, math, civics education, and financial literacy, supporting our teachers, but making sure that when our kids come out of school, they are either career ready or college ready. And I agree with you in the sense that each of these components, these pillars, reinforce one another. In the Obama administration, we would sometimes talk about this as intersectionality, which is you can't just address schools without addressing teachers and treating them as professionals. But you also can't address, the teachers in the schools without also addressing the conditions, at home, where our schools have become community centers. So I couldn't agree with you more.
And so of the policy areas, are there any that give you any pause? Based off of substance or financial implications?
No. I mean, one of the things that I want to do is make sure that we use taxpayer dollars wisely. Because in a state of Maryland where we deal with a high cost of living, a high tax burden, it can't be about raising taxes. We can't do that, and I won't. So for me, it's about making sure we get the best bang for our buck. So part of that for me is looking at, universal pre-K, where I believe we can work through public-private partnerships to get this done, to make sure that we're lessening the burden on government so that we can use those scarce resources for equally important priorities. You have seen universal pre-K supported by the Penn Foundation in Philadelphia, the Barr Foundation in Boston, the Gates Foundation across the country. And yet none of those foundations are real players here in Maryland. And so as governor, I will bring those private partnerships in state because that's how we are going to make sure we realize all of the 5 objectives in my first term.
Okay. So I'm going to have us focus on equity for a moment. Equity is something that is extremely important to Strong Schools Maryland and to our members. And as you shared, our students across the state are not achieving to the levels that we know that they can achieve. And this is regardless of where they live and even income levels. All of the students in Maryland, when we look at national and international standards, we are middle of the pack nationally, and then you look internationally, and the United States is middle of the pack. So then that leaves Maryland students internationally towards the bottom. So, keeping that in mind, that's how for all of Maryland students. But then if we look district by district and school by school, we see that we are not serving kids in disproportionate numbers. If we look specifically at Black and Brown students, students with disabilities, students with English as their second language, and students living in concentrations of poverty, we are not serving them. And so my question to you is, which specific Kerwin policy do you think would most likely address the inequities that we see?
Yeah, I mean, as I noted, I do think it is early childhood education because we realize that in our state, particularly here in Baltimore, but really, I was in Western Maryland rolling out a Western Maryland regional plan, and we were talking about how half of the kids who start in kindergarten are already far behind. Right? And that's where it just gets worse and worse year by year. Some of our children continue to be left behind. And so that's where I think it is one of the most strategic investments we can make. For every dollar we invest, we get about a $38 return. Half of that is between kindergarten and 12th grade, and the other half of that return is after 12th grade. And I think that's critically important. But it relates to this bigger issue for me, which is about closing that achievement gap. Because you realize that year by year, we are failing our children. And so I want to make sure that we do provide equitable opportunities, and some of that is, as you said, addressing the fact that some children have special needs, that some children are coming from more complicated backgrounds at home. Our schools have become community centers, and so that's why, knowing that the number of Maryland students living in poverty has basically doubled since 1990, our schools need to change to address that fact.
And another, just an important point to make is a lot of legislators and even residents across the state of Maryland, when they think of equity, they think about concentrations of poverty. But, if we look at the data that shows even in some of our wealthier counties and jurisdictions, especially, Black and brown students, if they are middle class, they are still not performing at the same level. And so,
Well, no, and I couldn't agree more. And I think it's such an important insight because you see it here in Baltimore City. Right
in Howard County,
Montgomery County, where I live now, in Baltimore County, where I grew up, where Johnny Cake Middle, Woodlawn High School, Edmondson Heights Elementary, where I went, those were struggling schools. By contrast or comparison to Towson or Pikesville, who you'd always sort of look at as those kind of shining schools that you'd aspire to, and it's just not fair.
Thank you. And so you spoke a little bit about funding and what your plans are, but I want to get a little bit more specific on that because although the financial recommendations from the Kirwan Commission, they are going to be released this fall. But we do know that the APA state study said that Maryland schools currently are underfunded by $2.9 billion every year to adequately educate our students. And so as future governor, how do you plan to fully fund and implement the Kirwan policies?
So when I was in the Obama administration, we would say, if you want to know your priorities, look at your budget. And so part of it is not trying to kind of scrape together the money to fund education after addressing every other concern. It's about recognizing that education has to be our priority. It is the building block for everything else. And so for me, that means, first, putting the casino revenues where they should be. Because the truth is that our current governor has been what I describe as a reverse Robin Hood. He has literally been stealing from the poor and giving to the rich. And we know that that's well over $1 billion that he took out of the casino fund. And I think we're going to remedy that come November. But that is an important piece of it. Part of it is making sure that we do develop the public-private partnerships so that we can work with outside partners who themselves recognize that these are key investments we need to make with our children. Third, it's about making sure that we renovate and reconstruct our schools, because we know that our schools are crumbling, but in ways that we actually find energy efficiencies as well as improvements in the water systems, and then reinvest those efficiencies in our schools. But it's also about making sure that we need to grow our economy. So I have promised and put forth a plan to create 250,000 new jobs in Maryland. What that will allow us to do is create $1 billion of increased revenue, but it'll also save us about $1 billion in savings, because when we put those folks to work, that means that they're employed as opposed to on social services. So this is where I have a very strong and firm commitment that we are absolutely going to fund the Kirwan Commission's recommendation of the $1.9 billion.
Okay, and you mentioned that you don't want to raise revenue to the state.
Raise taxes.
Raise taxes. Well, are there any other additional revenue streams that you foresee?
So as I mentioned, the 250,000 new jobs are definitely going to be some real employment opportunities. And this is where, it's to your point with education, I also think we need to recognize it more broadly, which is we've got to invest in infrastructure. We need to make sure that the Red Line gets resurrected, that we address the congestion around 695, that we are actually supporting our employers and our students so that they have the technical and vocational training so that they can get into the jobs that exist. And so that is going to be a key revenue stream, because we need to make sure that we have that additional funding. But as I said, my concern is that we have a governor who has been stealing public school funding and putting into private schools. We have a governor who has not been using the casino revenues as we should be. The casino revenues were supposed to be a supplement to public school funding that was coming out of the general funds. Instead, it's been a substitute. And so we've actually seen a decrease in the funding that's coming out of the general fund. I'm going to make sure we correct that.
Okay, thank you. And so let's shift again to accountability. Accountability is extremely important, especially if we look at the fact that we've increased funding for education over the years, and yet we have not seen outcomes for our students meet the level of funding that we've provided. And so how would that be different should you become governor? How would accountability look different?
So this is where I draw on my experiences working at the White House managing, a $51.6 billion budget at the State Department, running multi-billion-dollar initiatives at the White House. You have to have those accountability measures in place before the disbursement of funds, because otherwise you're pouring water into a bucket that already has holes. And so that's where, coming in on day one, we're going to do an assessment and an audit of the schools to kind of figure out where are we losing funds, where are we less efficient. And that matters, right? This past year we saw that our children were literally freezing in classrooms because we hadn't adequately funded our schools, but also made sure that we managed these construction projects. And at schools like Frederick Douglass, where my father taught, where my Lieutenant Governor Sharon Blake taught, there's a saying from Frederick Douglass, which is, it is easier to raise strong children than to repair broken men. And I think that's an important quote to keep in mind, because this is what's at stake. If we don't raise our children to be strong, to be educated, to be productive citizens, to be able to get jobs, then down the road we're going to be dealing with this in terms of the criminal justice system, in terms of social services. And that's where, when people say, well, how are you going to pay for any of these initiatives? My response is, look, we're paying for these one way or the other. I just think that we need to make the investments in our children so that they can realize their potential. It is not how Governor Hogan describes it, which is, simply a line item on a budget. It is a springboard for opportunity. And I know that because it's my life story.
Okay, thank you. And so in close, I want to have you share a little bit about your vision for Maryland students. And so if you were elected governor, what would it look like at the end of your 4-year terms? What accomplishments would Maryland students achieve because of your tenure as governor?
It'll be very different than the Maryland I grew up in the sense that, I remember what it was to sit in so-called temporary trailers that are still there decades later when I go back to those schools. And I remember trying to learn in freezing cold and sweltering heat. Those are the conditions that we sometimes put our kids in. I remember what it was to try to learn French in a foreign language class because of budget cuts where they couldn't hire another teacher. The teacher had to teach halfway through the year French and Spanish at the same time. I remember my parents having to pay out of pocket for school supplies because our schools were not equipping our teachers and treating them like the professionals they are. All of those things are going to change dramatically. What I'm going to do is empower the local community to raise our children. I'm going to empower teachers because what they do is God's work. I'm going to make sure that every child has a fighting chance to realize their potential, which means that from the time they start with their early childhood education to the time they graduate and beyond, I, as governor, am going to support them and let them know that I have their back, because I know that Maryland educators and schools had mine, and that's how I got a chance to go from a basement apartment, which is where my family grew up in, to being able to have the honor of a lifetime working as Michelle Obama's policy director on many of these issues like education that I think we all deeply care about.
Okay. And finally, is there anything else that you want to share with our community and with those viewing about your vision for Maryland students in general?
Yeah, I mean, I think my vision is very in line with your vision. And so I guess what I wanted to end with was a thank you, because I know that what you all do through Strong Schools, the fact that people are tuning in midday or finding times during very busy schedules to raise this issue, to fight for this issue, to fight for the kids who oftentimes don't quite have a voice yet, it matters. And I know that we need to have a partner in Annapolis on this issue. And so I hope you know that because this is personal to me, it is literally ingrained in my DNA. I hope you know that I am one of you, and I will be the best champion, not just as a friend, but really as a family member on this issue. So thank you again.
Well, thank you for joining us. Thank you for joining us this afternoon, and thanks to all of you for joining us. If you would like any more information on Strong Schools Maryland, I invite you to visit our website at www.strongschoolsmaryland.org. Thank you.